Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing well this week. We are about midway through, almost, I guess, a third of the way through December, almost to Christmas. And again, hope you're doing well. This week, I thought of, I've been not quite sure how to start each one of these each week. Just saying, hi, hope you're doing well. And then going right into it doesn't seem right. So I've looked at different ways people start their online Bible studies, and none of them quite seemed me. A lot of people doing goofy things, and I don't do goofy very well, at least intentionally. I do goofy unintentionally. Um, but I thought, one of the things that I do is books. So I thought each week through this series, at least, I would recommend some books that have helped shape my thinking on this topic, especially the big story of the Bible. And this week, it's actually not just a book, but it's a series of books called Unlocking the Bible Story. It's 4 volumes, and I think there's actually a companion volume for small group study. These are actually still available online. I got these probably 20 years ago, close to that, but they're still available online and not that expensive. $9, I think, each volume in paperback. The story of those is when I was in seminary in Chicago, I went to a church called Arlington Heights Evangelical Free Church. It's since changed its name to the Orchard. But Colin Smith was the pastor of the church, and he challenged the church to read through the Bible in a year, and his sermons followed the readings that we were doing in the Bible for that year. And so this is his, I think he added to it because there's more than 52 chapters in here, but this is him going through the Bible, and sitting under that kind of really fanned into flame, I guess, my love for not just the Bible, but the Bible's big story. It helped me understand all these little stories that I knew, again, growing up, but helped me get a grasp of the big story. So if you're looking for a Christmas present, maybe that's a good one. Unlocking the Bible Story by Colin Smith. And I can put a link to that in the description of this video later. But this week we take a turn in the story. And I don't know if you've ever, told stories to your kids and they kind of want to hurry you up and say, okay, get to the good part. Well, if you've been saying, okay, Dan, get to the good part, this is kind of the beginning of the good part. Today we talk about Genesis chapter 12 and chapters that follow that, and the story of Abram who becomes Abraham. We're getting to the good stuff. It's not the best stuff yet, but it's really good stuff. Genesis 1 through 11, we're dealing with the kind of the prehistory of Israel, the prehistory of humanity. And so it's the whole human story. It involves all of us. But in chapter 12, the call of Abram, or Abraham, the story gets more focused. Not everyone is on stage anymore. One family and his descendants take center stage and carry the storyline of the Bible forward. So that's what we're going to be focused on, Genesis 12 and the call of Abram and chapters that follow that. But just a brief recap, and I want to park on something here for a minute. Last week we talked about this, not solution, but God addressing the sin problem in a radical way. Things had really declined since the fall, since even Cain and Abel, to where the thought of everyone's heart was always wicked, is how the Bible describes it, Genesis chapter 6. And so God resolves to wipe humanity out, wipe the face of the earth clean, and start again with one family, a man named Noah, who had found favor in God's sight. So Noah builds an ark. God wipes the face of the earth clean except for Noah and the 8 people that are with him in the ark. He and his wife, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. But we saw last week that didn't solve the sin problem. As soon as man walks off out of the ark, in essence, Noah gets drunk, and there's this whole embarrassing story about his drunken nakedness and his sons walking in on him. And Noah pronounces a curse on Canaan. Shortly after that, we read that. That's Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter, later in Genesis chapter 10, we get what's called the Table of the Nations, and the story of how Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their descendants become the great peoples of the earth that we read about in, frankly, the rest of the Bible and the rest of human history. But I want to park there for a second, not because that part of the story is so important, but because it's been so misused, especially by American Christians in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even into the 20th century. How it's been misused is to defend, support the institution of slavery, the enslavement of African and African Americans. The curse on Canaan is sometimes referred to as the curse of Ham. Ham, the name Ham, some have contended, means hot or burnt or dark, and is seen to imply dark-skinned peoples. And add to that, when you're looking at the Table of Nations, among Ham's descendants are the Egyptians and the Cushites. The Cushites are sub-Saharan Africans, Ethiopia and beyond. So the faulty reasoning goes is that the curse that Noah pronounces, that Kanan is how it's actually worded in the Bible, will be the slave of his brothers, is seen as a defense for the institution of slavery. That is so incredibly problematic that I want to address it. It's problematic because the name Ham and reading into it as burnt and dark-skinned is wild, partly because the people that are descendants of Ham are not all dark-skinned. Caucasian peoples are also listed among his descendants. And the curse isn't pronounced on Ham, it's pronounced on Canaan specifically. And it's from the Noah's grandson, Kanan, that we get tribes like the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, etc., the Canaanites. Remember, it's Moses who is writing this story, and he's writing it as the people are eventually about to go into the land and dispossess the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Amorites. This is his explanation of why Israel has been given the right to go in and take these lands. It's part of the explanation. It is not a defense of the institution of American slavery. Okay, I don't want to beat that to death, but that is such a misused part of Scripture and a horrible part of kind of our heritage that I think it's right to spend a minute or two parked on that. Okay, but you move on from the Table of Nations and the outlining of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and you get to Genesis chapter 11 and another low point in human history, the story of Babel. God had commanded Noah when he came out of the ark that he and his descendants should be fruitful and multiply, kind of a reiteration of the command to Adam, and spread out over all the earth and fill it. But when you get to the story of Babel, you see man intentionally disobeying that command and saying, no, we're going to be safer, more productive if we stay cloistered together in one city. And they resolve that they're going to make a name for themselves. They're going to pursue their own reputation, their own agenda, their own glory. And so they build this tower that reaches to the heavens, and they are incredibly proud of this tower. They built a tower that reaches all the way to the heavens. And it's written really ironically because God, who is in heaven, says, in essence, oh, you built a tower? Let me come down and see your little tower. They think their tower is this wonderful achievement, a stairway to heaven itself. But God has to descend from heaven to even see the thing. This is beautiful irony in Genesis chapter 11. And because of their disobedience and their hubris, God confuses the language and forces them to spread out over the face of the earth and to fill it. The name Babel, from which eventually comes the name Babylon, was thought by the Babylonians to mean Golden Gate, or the Gate of the gods. For the author of Genesis, the name Babel doesn't evoke those kind of glorious images. It evokes similar sounding words like folly and flood, and means confusion. So far from being the last word, this high point of human achievement and human culture, it's the ultimate symbol of man's failure when he attempts to go it alone and strike out on his own in defiance of his creator. That's Genesis chapter 11. Then when you get to Genesis chapter 12, again, the story takes this turn. And it's not about humanity and all the nations. It's God focusing in on one man and his family, his descendants. This is what we read in Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Why did God choose Abram, later to become Abraham? The short answer is we don't know if we're looking for strictly earthly kind of reasons. Abraham wasn't a worshiper of the Lord at this point. Joshua chapter 24 verse 2 tells us that he worshipped idols like everyone else around him. He was living in Ur of the Chaldees, which is modern day Iraq. But God calls him out of grace, not because he was so good, so great, out of grace, and so that his purpose of election would stand. God's purpose of election throughout Scripture is a phrase that highlights that God chooses sovereignly, freely, not compelled by man's goodness or anything in man. So of Israel, he's going to say, "I didn't choose you because you are so big, so great, so powerful, so good. I simply chose you so that my grace would stand, so that my purposes would prevail." No one's going to look at you and say, "Oh, well, God chose them, obviously." No, I did something great out of nothing. And that's what he's doing with Abram, so that his purpose and election will stand. And God makes these promises to Abram. Interesting, if you look at this text, the one we were just looking at, the word bless is repeated 5 times. And many commentators point out that that is a deliberate choice by the author, set in opposition to the 5 times the word curse appears in Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 11, the word curse shows up 5 times. And here in God's promises to Abram, he promises to bless 5 times, to undo, in essence, all the cursing. These promises can be boiled down into 3 things. I promise seed, land, and blessing. Seed, land, and blessing. But the blessing isn't just for Abram and his descendants. The blessing is for the whole world. That last phrase, "and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed," in essence is a purpose phrase. I'm going to do all this for you so that you will bless all the families of the earth. God is very intentional. He's narrowing his focus to Abram and his descendants, but not so that they will hoard the blessings, but so that his blessings will flow through Abram and his descendants, especially his one special descendant, to the whole world. This is Genesis chapter 12. These promises and this arrangement, that's kind of a bad way to say covenant. I like the word covenant much better, is repeated 4 or 5 times in the rest of Genesis. Genesis chapter 15, we read these words. "Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet been completed, or is not yet complete. This is the first time that these promises take on the form of covenant. Abram was called in Genesis chapter 12, and he up and leaves. He leaves his family, he leaves his relatives, except for a select few, and travels from Ur of the Chaldees into the land of Canaan, where he is a sojourner. God promises that this land will become yours, but not yet. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, that you don't see it now. Abraham has at this point complained that he has no biological children of his own. And God says, just wait, it's coming. And those descendants will take this land. It will be their land, but not yet. Speaking of the time that they're in Egypt, he says they're going to be sojourners and slaves for 400 years, because the people that are living in this land right now, the Amorites, their sin hasn't been filled up yet. Eventually it will be, and I'll bring in your descendants to displace them as my instruments of punishment on the Amorites, but not yet. Abraham at this point says, okay, God, this is fantastic, but how will I know that this is going to happen? And God says, gather some animals, some heifers, some sheep, some goats, cut them in two and lay them apart, and wait. And eventually, a deep sleep falls on Abram, and he sees this vision of a smoking fire pot coming down and going between the two halves of the animals. This is a way that a covenant was struck, was cut, is actually the right word, in the ancient Near East. The two parties would slice animals in half and then walk between the two halves of the animals, in essence saying, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, may it be as this to me. May I be cut in half. Interestingly, in this covenant scenario, Abram doesn't walk between the two halves. God is taking it fully on himself to meet the obligations of this covenant. That doesn't mean Abram doesn't have obligations. He does, and they're going to come in Genesis chapter 17. And we've already seen Abram, he was given a command to get up and go, and he fulfilled the obligation there and obeyed. But here this covenant is taking definitive form. In Genesis chapter 17, time is marched on. Abram is now 99 years old. He has a biological son, but it's not with Sarah, his wife. It's with Ishmael, her servant. I'm sorry, it's not with Ishmael. It's with Hagar, her servant, and his son's name is Ishmael. And Isaiah is thinking, I'm talking too fast. Stop. Abram is thinking, maybe it's going to be Ishmael. God comes to him and says, Abram, who is now called Abraham, it's not with Sarai, it's going to be with Sarai, your wife, who's now Sarah, not with Ishmael. I know this seems impossible, but with your descendants through Sarah, his name's going to be Isaac, I'm making an everlasting covenant. Now walk before me and be blameless. And he adds the requirement of circumcision to this covenant. On the 8th day, all the male children who are born to your household are to be circumcised. Again, an act of cutting, reminding them that this covenant was cut with God. Genesis chapter 18, God again comes to promise Abraham and reaffirms that it's with Sarah, not with Ishmael, and you're going to name him Isaac. In chapter 18, we get a little bit more detail about God's reasoning behind calling Abraham. God has this kind of internal conversation with himself. He's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord says, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. In other words, he's my chosen man for this task. should I hide what I'm about to do from him? For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. From the beginning, these blessings on Abraham were not to be hoarded, and they weren't to be taken lightly. He was supposed to walk before God in obedience, in righteousness, and justice. Justice has from the beginning been at the heart of God's concern for his people, for the world, establishing justice. The story continues. Abraham and Sarah do have a child, naming him Isaac. In Genesis 22, the unthinkable is asked, and God says, "Take your son Isaac, your only son, whom you love." Those words should echo in our ears. They're reiterated in the New Testament. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah." Abraham takes his servants and Isaac and travels to Mount Moriah in obedience to what the Lord has commanded. And when they get to Mount Moriah, he says to the servants, "Nope, just me and my son go." And he loads the wood on Isaac's back and carries the fire and heads up the mountain. And Isaac says, "Dad, we've got the wood, we've got the fire, but where's the lamb? Where's the sacrifice?" And faithfully, in a faith-filled kind of way, Abraham says, God will provide the lamb. Isaac goes through with this and allows himself, as at least a teenager, if not a full-grown man now, to be tied to the altar. And as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, God says, "Stop. I've tested you. I've seen how genuine your faith is. Look in the thicket," and there in the thicket is a ram. In this instance, we see just so clearly God's provision of the ultimate sacrifice. The promises to Abraham in all of these chapters that we've glanced at, that's all we've done is been able to glance at them, all these promises renew the vision that God has set out for humanity in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Like Noah, Abraham is in essence a second Adam figure. Adam was given the Garden of Eden. Abraham is promised the land of Canaan. Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply. Abraham is promised descendants as numerous as the stars in the heaven or the dust of the earth. God walked with Adam in Eden. Abraham is called to walk before God. In this way, the advent of Abraham is seen as the answer to the problems that are set out in Genesis 1 through 11. Through him, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham is portrayed in essence as the anti-Babel. In the story of Babel, mankind was disobedient, unfaithful, and they were scattered. But God, through Abraham, is bringing and creating a new humanity, uniting humanity again in faith and in obedience. When the people of Babel tried to claim for themselves a name, renown, God gives freely out of grace to Abraham. Abraham shows us a new way to live, a new kind of living, not trusting in your own resources, not trusting in your own abilities or in the security of the collective, like the people at Babel did. Instead, living by faith, faith that compels obedience. He believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He believed God and left Ur of the Chaldees and traveled to an unknown land. So in Abraham, we see this new kind of humanity, this new kind of living. And we see God's purpose in election. Again, I want to reiterate, election wasn't for the sake of Abraham. It wasn't so that he would be blessed and hoard the blessings. He's chosen, yes, but chosen for the sake of the whole. Through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. There is debate on whether or not we should call this covenant that God has struck with Abraham, that he's cut with Abraham, an unconditional covenant. And in a way it is. There doesn't seem to be any language. This seems to be an everlasting covenant, not a conditional covenant. If you do this, I will do this kind of language. But there are certainly conditions. Abraham was called to get up and go, was called to walk before the Lord, was called to circumcise the children that were born into his household. I don't like that unconditional and conditional covenant dichotomy, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks when we talk about the Mosaic covenant as well. Okay, so I have talked for 26 minutes, and I haven't asked the question yet, what about that golden thread? This is how I'm going to end every one of these series. What about the golden thread? Where do we see Jesus, the golden thread in this story? Well, it's hard to miss Jesus in the story of Genesis 22 and Abraham being called to offer as a sacrifice his son Isaac. The passage says, so Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh is God's name here. The Lord provides. Certainly, the Lord's greatest provision comes in the person of Jesus Christ, the ultimate sacrifice. What Abraham was called to do in Genesis 22, but didn't have to do, it's so horrific. Offer your son, your only son whom you love. God does. He gives his son, his only son, whom he loves, so that we might be blessed. In the same passage, Genesis 22, God says, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. The blessing wasn't just for Abraham, but was for the nations. The descendant, the seed of Abram, would be a blessing to the whole world. That's the foundational covenant promise that God promises, that God makes to Abram. And that is fulfilled only in Jesus Christ. Israel was a great nation, but they never rose to the point of being the blessing to the whole world. It's only in Jesus, the true Israel, that promise is fulfilled. I hope this study of the Abrahamic covenant and Abraham's story not only helps you understand maybe the big picture a little bit better, but this Advent season maybe fans into greater flame that longing you have to be a part of the blessing and to experience the blessing of Jesus. Hope you have a great rest of your week. If you have questions or comments, oh, Andrew, I see a comment here. I'm wondering if the phrase cut a deal had its origins. I think it did. I think it did have its origins in that idea of walking between two animals. Biblical concept. It's amazing how much of our modern idioms have biblical roots. I think this is one of them. Well, I was saying, hope you have a great week. If you have questions, leave comments, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. And again, have a great week and walk with the Lord.